Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. Our guest today is Eberhard Kienle, who is a Middle East expert at the Center for National Scientific Research here in France. And we're talking about Egypt and particularly what some people have called President Morsi's coup against the army. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
How do you read the sackings of these two army chiefs?
It seems to me, and everybody says it, that President Morsi took advantage of the attack against the border post in the Sinai to clean up, from his point of view, the army, at least the higher echelons of the army. That he did, and part and parcel, of course, this is part and parcel of the tug of war between the army and the Islamists, or between the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brothers, that has been going on, in a sense, ever since Mubarak fell, at least over the last couple of months.
Do you think the army knew that there would be a political price to pay for that intelligence failure in the Sinai?
Well, I think all this went rather quickly, so I'm not so sure whether they thought about it in these terms. It was an embarrassment, of course, yeah. But again, I mean, the question is the army really responsible for that? Who is responsible for it? We don't know. And also, of course, all this, one has to say, is, again, part and parcel of the problem of the peace treaty with Israel, in a sense, because it doesn't allow the Egyptian armed forces to be extremely present on the Sinai. So, I mean, there are all sorts of questions. But I think President Morsi moved very swiftly and very quickly, and maybe to the surprise of Tantawi and his colleagues.
Observers have been speculating that part of this deal between the generals and Morsi could have been to grant immunity to Field Marshal Tantawi. Would there be any reasons, at least on paper, why Field Marshal Tantawi might need immunity?
Oh yes, there might be many reasons. I mean, we know that Egyptians like to go to court, and Egyptians like to test all sorts of issues in court. Now, Tantawi was, of course, de facto president. He was the chair of SCAF, of the military committee, over some 18 months, and he was responsible as president for all sorts of things, including, of course, the use of the security services, firearms. Remember the Maspero incident in front of television and all these things. They might all, in a sense, be put at his doorstep. We don't know. And then, of course, there are allegations of corruption which go back to his time as Minister of Defense under Mubarak. So, of course, there might be reasons, but I don't think that this is a major reason. I just think that Morsi took advantage of this particular event to at least show to the Egyptians that he is in charge. It doesn't necessarily mean he is in charge, because changing a 76-year-old defense minister against a 56-year-old does not mean that the army itself is decapitated.
It's important to underline that this doesn't mean the army is defeated. How are they going to protect their interests from now on, do you think?
Well, I think the army will retreat, in a sense, to the barracks, as it has always been. The army has always been sort of the great absent actor in Egyptian politics. It was never really in the limelight, although all presidents, of course, until recently were officers. But once they were elected, they wore suits and no longer uniforms, and so there was sort of semblance of a civilian government. Now, the army will retreat into the background, but it will defend cautiously and quietly and effectively, I suppose, its economic interests. It's one of the major economic actors in the country. The officers will defend all their entitlements. They're certainly the best paid civil servants in the country. And also, I suppose, they have a say, and they will have a say, in where the country goes politically.
You don't think we should make too much of this age gap between Field Marshal Tantawi and his replacement, which is 20 years difference? There's not a generational issue here in terms of the accommodation between President Morsi and the army?
I mean, there may be, but just I would like to point out that not only Tantawi was retired, but also Annan, the chief of staff, who is much younger than Tantawi. So in a sense, I think Annan is roughly of the same age as the new Minister of Defense. So I'm not so sure. I think it's more a question of getting rid of the symbols of SCAF, of the symbols of military rule, of showing to the public that he is in charge without necessarily being in charge, and of course bringing in people at the helm of the army, at the top of the army, who he thinks he can work with more effectively and who are sort of a little bit closer to him, as I would say, ideologically. We know that Sisi, the new Minister of Defense, has some sort of Islamist leanings, even though he is not probably a member of the Muslim Brothers.
Well, perhaps President Morsi really is in charge because he doesn't have a counterweight. I mean, Parliament is not working at the moment.
That's certainly true. I mean, President Morsi is in charge at the moment. At least now he's in charge quite clearly. He has tested the resistance, the capacity of the army to resist, which at the moment has not resisted, not openly, but which will probably resist more quietly. And indeed, he is concentrating all major powers in his hands, except the judiciary, which in Egypt is very often independent, including the Supreme Court. But there is certainly a question here that abolishing the, however undemocratic, additional constitutional declaration issued by the military in last June leaves President Morsi basically with all powers, legislative, executive, and what have you.
But isn't it in his interest to reconvene Parliament, given that the Muslim Brotherhood is the biggest political force there? Or, I mean, could he do that, in fact?
Yes, he could, I suppose, do this because the constitutional reality in Egypt at this particular moment is extremely fluid. Nobody actually knows which of the various texts apply. And of course, everybody has a different opinion and everybody tries to mobilize one of these constitutional declarations or the old constitution and other texts and, of course, various courts of law in his own favor. So the situation is fluid. He could do this. However, if he did that, it would clearly bring him in conflict with the last remaining counterpower, which is the Supreme Court, which has dissolved Parliament, or which asked the executive authorities to dissolve Parliament. And I think this would clearly show, or this would probably show to many Egyptians, that he is not ready to accommodate other views and other political actors. And I think he doesn't want to do this, as he has only been elected with 51% of the votes.
So he probably needs to wait for a Supreme Court guidance on what to do next with regards to Parliament.
Well, I think he hopes that the new constitution will be drawn up rather quickly. And under the new constitution, of course, new parliamentary elections would have to be held anyway. So if he is lucky, this will happen sooner rather than later. But of course, nobody can guarantee that he will be lucky. And of course, one might wish the Egyptians that the drafting of the constitution takes a little longer, because a good constitution cannot be drafted only a couple of months.
We focused a lot on politics, Eberhard Kienle, but of course everyday life is very hard, and Egyptians do want jobs, they want their rubbish to be collected, they want the power cuts to stop. Can Morsi do anything about that?
Well, I suppose he can, ultimately. But it's quite natural, I suppose, that in a period of transition of that sort and of that sort of magnitude, most of the political actors, including Morsi, including the army, including the other parties, try to consolidate their positions, try to test each other, and basically try to dominate the institutions. So that comes first, obviously. Now, of course, the Egyptians are waiting, and they're waiting for good reasons. And I think they will not wait forever, and they will indeed put the blame of the dysfunctioning economy not on Mubarak's doorstep in the future, but on Morsi's. And you may remember that between the parliamentary elections and the presidential elections, the Muslim Brothers lost a significant number of votes already, because they were blamed for inefficiency.
And of course, in Tunisia, the whole Arab Spring started because of, lack of opportunities. I mean, that was one of the sparks.
I suppose it was a combination of economic grievances of various sorts, that's a very complex issue, but also of the impossibility to express these grievances under authoritarian rule. So I think it was two things, in Egypt and in Tunisia. But clearly there is this dimension, and something has to be done about it. The only problem is to restart the Egyptian economy after 18 months of decline, and after many years of, I would sort of say, not very useful economic development, which basically privileged some and not the others, or not the majority. It is very difficult to create conditions in which people will get jobs, will get decent salaries, will get all what they are waiting for. This will take time in any case, and I think it will take even more time now, because for some 18 months not much has happened. But The real problem, I think, is will the Muslim Brothers, Morsi himself, will they have the answers to that? And I'm afraid the Nahda program that they issued some time ago for the economic and the general revival of Egypt does not provide the adequate answers.
Why not? What kind of economy does Egypt need, do you think, that they're not addressing?
What the Muslim Brothers at this particular stage advocate is basically, and one famous businessman close to the Muslim Brothers said that quite explicitly. I can't quote him now verbatim, but that was about a couple of months ago, who said, well, there was nothing wrong with Mubarak's economic policies. The only thing that was wrong with them was corruption. Now, that, of course, tells us that they would probably continue with a very lightly regulated liberal economy in which crony capitalism, just of the other sort now, people close to the Muslim Brothers, like Shatter, like Khairat al-Shatter, who was supposed to be their first candidate for president. Lots of people who are in and around the Muslim Brothers are very successful business people, and they would probably only like to replace the Izzas and Mansours who were close to the previous government. So I don't think they think very much about structural reforms, about how Egypt could sort of move up on the surplus ladder and indeed create jobs, create income, and become a more developed country in industrial and economic terms.
Danger of exchanging one crony capitalism for another kind of cronyism. Thank you very much for your analysis. Eberhard Kienle, Middle East expert for the Centre for National Scientific Research here in France. Stay tuned for news coming up on France 24.